Chapter 5. The Ash in the Architecture. The descent into the lower gorge was not a journey measured in leagues, but in the slow, systematic stripping away of my remaining human geometry. Ahead of me, Kaelen walked with a heavy, uncoordinated gait, his massive shoulders hunched beneath the weight of his travel pack. The leather straps groaned against his plate armor with a flat, mundane friction that felt entirely wrong to my vibrating senses. His back was an unyielding wall of solid iron, a silent monument to a terminal, heart-breaking resolve. He did not look back at me. Not once. The silence between us was denser than the limestone cliffs rising precipitously on either side, a heavy, suffocating barrier that cut through the narrow corridor like a cold iron blade. To our right, Elara glided through the jagged shadows of the canyon wall. Her amber eyes were wide, glittering with a restless, uncharacteristic vigilance as she constantly scanned the high, sun-bleached ridges above us. Her hand never left the silver hilt of her hidden dagger, her thumb clicking against the guard in a rapid, nervous rhythm that betrayed the cold calculation of a scavenger who realized she was traveling in the immediate wake of an apex predator. Without the active fuel of the patron, my body was an agonizingly precise ledger of physical decay. The Holy Hangover had settled from a violent, spasming tempest into a heavy, grinding silt that filled my joints. Every time my left boot struck the loose, uneven shale of the wash, a sharp, white-hot needle of pain shot directly up into my pelvis, reminding me of the mundane laws of biology and friction. My breath came in shallow, dry wheezes that tasted intensely of dust, old iron, and the permanent, bitter residue of copper that had settled onto the back of my tongue. The air inside the gorge was cool, sharp, and smelling of sun-baked mineral crust and bitter sagebrush, a completely physical, unyielding environment that demanded absolute compliance from my fragile mortal shell. I reached into the pocket of my traveling tunic, my trembling left fingers brushing against the cold, dead leather of the Chronicle of Oaths. It felt like a block of inert lead, completely satisfied by the 4 lives that had been unmade in the juniper grove above. I wanted to detest it. I wanted to cast the ancient tome into the deep fissure of the canyon floor. But my hand lingered on the dragon hide cover, drawing a twisted, sickly comfort from the knowledge that it was the only object in this fractured wilderness that still possessed a definitive, unalterable blueprint. By midnight, the gorge widened into a jagged, asymmetric amphitheater of fractured slate and towering columns of dry limestone. The twilight had long since dissolved into an oppressive, ink-black darkness, illuminated only by the cold, indifferent glare of a pale moon that cast long, geometric shadows across our path. Kaelen called a halt beneath the overhang of a massive split boulder that looked like an iron wedge driven into the earth. He dropped his heavy pack with a dull, echoing thud, immediately sitting with his back pressed firmly against the stone. He pulled a dry strip of ration meat from his belt, but did not offer any to me. His hands rested flat on his knees, and even through the gloom, I could see them vibrating, a subtle, uncontrollable tremor born from the concussive shock of his great sword being warped into a useless wave of steel by the aura of ozone around my body. Elara crouched near the opposite edge of the overhang, her daggers resting flat across her knees. The moon caught the silver of her guards, casting thin, sharp lines of light across her pale, guarded face. "The canyon floor opens up into a wider basin about 2 miles ahead," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, brittle whisper that barely cut through the quiet. She didn't turn her head to face me as she spoke. but the tribunal's secondary watchtower on the eastern ridge has its signaling lantern lit. If they've noticed the dust from the rock slide we left behind, they'll have outriders patrolling the lower narrows before dawn. We need to stay in the deep shadows. We move when the shadow hits the basin, Kaelen replied. His voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of the rich, grounding gravity that had once been my anchor during my hours of administrative isolation in Dawnspire. It was the voice of a soldier delivering an itinerary to a condemned man. If his patron can leave him his legs, he will keep the pace. If he falls behind, the sequence will solve itself. The words were a silver spike driven directly through my pride, yet I could not find the human breath to argue. I sank down against the opposite wall of the cave, my knees clicking loudly like wooden gears in the quiet enclosure. I leaned my head back, closing my eyes, desperate for a single moment of genuine human reflection. I tried to return to the archive. In my mind, I rebuilt my oak study, the exact placement of my horn inkwell, the neat red ink margins I had drawn with a brass ruler, the disciplined, muted breathing of the junior clerks balancing their columns of tithing records. I tried to summon the face of Cyrus, the young boy whose columns I had meticulously rewritten in the lower vaults so he wouldn't be whipped by the severe assessors. I wanted to hold on to that memory like a shield. I wanted to prove to the silence in my chest that I had once believed in the sanctity of mercy within the law, that I had once been a man who protected the weak, not a vector of decay that turned them into entries to be rubbed out. But the memory was wrong. When I reached for Cyrus's face, I found the features had been eaten away, replaced by a smooth, blank expanse of grey parchment. The oak desks of my past were gone, translating into massive blocks of polished obsidian that rose at impossible 90-degree angles. A useless ledger, the patron murmured. The transition was instantaneous. The entity didn't wake with a roar. It expanded like a single drop of black ink, falling into a basin of clear water. The coarse smell of the sagebrush and the cold mineral dust vanished instantly. The air inside the overhang became thick, pressing against my eardrums until the sound of the wind grew distant and muffled, as if it were blowing across a great, dark lake miles away. The overwhelming, cloying sweetness of decaying white lilies flooded my nostrils, accompanied by the sharp, artificial hiss of static electricity that turned my cold sweat into a freezing mask across my face. I tensed, my jaw locking until my teeth cracked with an ancient stiffness. The physical pain in my left instep and the dull ache in my joints were suddenly gone, muffled by a cold, abstract current of electricity that began to thrum behind my cheekbones. The soldier is an obstacle, the entity whispered inside my consciousness, its tone like silk dragging over broken glass, completely indistinguishable from my own deepest analytical thoughts. He binds his heart to a dead city. He is a variable that seeks to maintain the friction. Look beyond his numbers, Torin. Look at the clock. I opened my eyes, and my human vision shifted into a terrifying dual perspective. I could still see Kaelen's rigid, armored form, but superimposed over him was a shifting latticework of glowing, golden threads, the delicate, fragile structural lines of order that bound his soul to his vows. And past his shoulder, through the mouth of the cave, the landscape was glitching. The rugged canyon didn't descend in a natural slope. It was mapped out in thousands of perfectly straight, iridescent purple vectors that intersected at 90-degree angles, projecting a cold, mathematical geometry across the dead basin. "Torin?" Elara's voice hissed, her amber eyes widening as she noticed the sudden shift in my posture. She dropped into a low crouch, her daggers catching the pale moonlight. "Kaelen, get back from him." His eyes, The pupils are fracturing again. Kaelen did not flinch. He stood up slowly, his massive height completely blocking the view of the canyon wash, his face a mask of cold, hard stone. He stepped closer until his heavy leather boots were inches from my knees, his hand resting heavily on the pommel of his sword. "Torin," he said, his voice dangerously low, a warning vibration that made the short hairs on my arms stand up. "Look at me. Focus on the sequence. You are a man of the archive. Do not unleash that fire." "I am not unleashing anything, Kaelen," I said. To my own ears, my voice was no longer human. It was a chorus of two distinct tones, speaking in perfect, unsettling unison, one high and raspy, the other deep, resonant, and dead. I am merely observing the calculation. The secondary watchtower on the ridge has already completed its rotation. The scouts are not coming. They are a repetition of a line we have already rubbed out in the grove above. They are an unnecessary consumption of space. "You're speaking in equations again," Kaelen roared softly, his jaw set in a hard, desperate line. "You're using the exact same words you used right before you turned Joran's horse into soot. Look at your hands, Torin. You're unmaking the world, one line at a time." I looked down at my lap. My right hand, still numb and stiff as river ice, was twitching in rhythmic, involuntary pulses. The deep violet stain under my fingernails was glowing with a faint, static charge that hissed through the quiet cave. Yet, the analytical, orderly machine that had spent decades categorizing the tithing records of Dawnspire was entirely functional enough to recognize the rightness of the entity's logic. "The law you protect is a cage, Kaelen," I said, my posture straight as a plumb line as I stood up without using the wall for support. The physical exhaustion in my limbs was a distant variable, completely overridden by the higher architecture of the patron. The structure we built in Dawnspire was already rotting from the center. The columns were false. The metrics were a temporary illusion designed to keep the civilized districts from seeing the sky. The entity isn't the monster. It is simply resolving the conflict in the most direct, efficient way possible. "The cage kept people safe, Torin." Kaelen stepped closer, his broad chest nearly touching my shoulder, his large hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before pressing firmly against my sternum, right over my pounding, erratic heart. His grip was tight, his fingers biting through my leather coat. "The law kept that child in the caravan from being turned to ash. If your new perspective requires us to liquefy the earth and dissolve our vows, then your new world is a slaughterhouse. Where is the man who helped Cyrus? Is he still in there, or has that thing completely rubbed him out?" The question was a silver spike driven directly into my skull. For a terrifying second, the human memory of the boy's terrified sniffling in the candle-lit vault rushed back, a desperate surge of pure human love for Kaelen, a desire to grab his plate armor, to weep into his torn tunic, to beg him to hold me down before the cold fire took my limbs again. "An error in judgment," the patron hissed, a sudden hot current of wildfire flooding my chest and completely obliterating the internal protest. The boy was a defective cog. By preserving his mistake, you prolonged his stagnation. You rebuilt the cage around his neck. Solve for zero, Torin. Clear the entry. "No!" My soul shrieked from its dark corner, a passenger trapped behind my own eyes, screaming at my fingers to relax. But my body was no longer mine. My left hand rose entirely without my consent, my fingers tracing a clean, vertical line through the heavy, lily-scented air of the cave, the air before Kaelen fractured. A sudden, sharp chime, like a great cathedral bell cracking in half, echoed through the hollow stone enclosure. The raw, liquid purple fire did not erupt as a blast. It flowed silently along the geometric vectors of the grid, tracing the straight lines projected across the cave floor. Kaelen bellowed in shock as the solid limestone beneath his boots visibly softened upon contact with the aura, the rock dissolving into a dark, viscous slurry of liquefied stone and raw, crackling heat that sent him stumbling backward into the dirt. "Torin, stop!" Elara screamed, leaping through the shadows with her daggers drawn, her amber eyes wide with an absolute, terminal horror as the purple flame whipped past her cloak. But the entity wasn't finished with the calculation. I raised my right hand, my violet-stained fingers locking into a rigid, claw-like grip as the sky outside the cave mouth fractured. A sonic boom of pure, discordant purple lightning ripped through the low clouds, leaving a jagged, smoking scar across the twilight of the basin. The concussive wave struck the high cliffs above the watchtower, and the solid stone didn't crumble into a natural rock slide. It split along perfect cubic fracture lines. Massive blocks of limestone, each one a perfect 10-foot cube, dropped cleanly from the height, slamming into the ravine floor with a series of dull, rhythmic thuds that sealed the path completely. "Unmake the friction," the entity sang, its voice a deafening, beautiful frequency that filled my head with the music of dead stars. The violet light vanished instantly. The entity snapped shut like an iron ledger being closed by an angry master. The withdrawal was a physical execution. My knees slammed into the dirt with a jarring shock that felt as though my kneecaps had been driven directly into my pelvis. The world slammed back into its mundane, physical dimensions with the concussive force of an iron gate dropping into place. The Holy Hangover arrived not as a gradual weight, but as an absolute, crushing collapse of my entire nervous system. The hollow, sucking vacuum in my chest exploded, my lungs turning into sacks of dry fire that refused to expand. Every gasping attempt to pull in air was a brutal, agonized negotiation with my throat, bringing up a torrent of thick, copper-flavored fluid that choked me. I fell onto my face, my cheek pressed into the cold, oil-slick mud where the limestone floor had been unmade. The taste of copper was absolute, a heavy, metallic weight that seemed to coat my entire mouth, my tongue feeling like a dry, heavy stone that had been soaked in old blood. My vision was a ruined ledger. The entire center of my field of view was replaced by a roaring, chaotic mass of black and grey static, leaving only the dark, blurry margins of the canyon walls visible. My right arm was completely dead, the skin of my forearm translucent and white as river ice, the fingertips a deep, permanent violet that throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. I clutched at the earth with my left hand, my body shaking in violent, uncontrollable spasms as a cold, greasy sweat drenched my clothes. I felt diminished, shrunken, a pathetic, hollowed-out husk that had dared to play host to an apex predator of the void. Don't look at me," I choked out, a wet, bloody froth escaping my lips as I tried to pull my legs toward my chest. "Kaelen, I couldn't stop the vector." The sound of boots scrambling over the loose shale was slow, hesitant, and heavy. I managed to roll onto my side, my blurry eyes tracking Kaelen's shadow as it finally fell over me. He was standing 5 paces away, his hands empty, his face entirely devoid of the anger he had shown before. It was blank, white, and hollowed out by an absolute, terminal horror. He looked at the cubed rock slide blocking the basin pass, then down at the dark, purple-tinted soot that was all that remained of the stone roots under the overhang. "Kaelen," I whispered, extending my left hand toward him, my fingers trembling like an old man's. The law was a cage. He didn't take my hand. He stepped back, a single, deliberate pace that felt more distant than the length of the wastes. "You didn't just break the stone, Torin," he said, his voice flat, completely empty of the gravity that had once grounded my mind. It was the voice of a man speaking to an executioner. "You didn't even blink. When the fire took the floor, you looked like you were balancing a ledger. You looked like you were correcting a spelling error on a scrap of waste parchment." He turned away from me, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his pack. He walked toward the edge of the cave, where Elara was already gathering her gear, her movements frantic, her amber eyes wide with an absolute, uncharacteristic terror as she looked at the perfect cubic blocks of stone sealing the pass. "We leave," Kaelen said to her, his voice reaching me through the dark static of my hearing. "We head into the lower gorge, the watchtower on the ridge. If it's there, it knows we're here." "And the High Cleric?" Elara asked, her voice shaking slightly as she pointed her dagger toward my shivering frame in the dirt. Kaelen didn't look back at me. He began to walk down the steep incline into the shadows of the lower canyon. If his patron can leave him his legs, he can follow. If not, let the sequence solve itself. I dragged myself up using a petrified stump for support, my joints popping with a stiffness that felt ancient. The nausea nearly forced me back to my knees, but I stood, my fingers reaching into my bag to touch the cold, dead hide of the Chronicle of Oaths. It was inert now, its hunger completely satisfied by the architecture that had been unmade in the cave. As I took my first, stumbling step down the ridge into the deepening twilight of the gorge, the low, rhythmic hum began again in the center of my skull, a soft, velvet vibration that eased the blinding headache behind my eyes and replaced my human guilt with a cold, terrifying serenity. "They are moving toward the gate, Torin," the voice whispered, completely indistinguishable from my own deepest thoughts. "They think they are running away from you. They don't understand that every step they take on this frayed earth is just another line we have already drawn for them." The taste of copper remained thick and permanent on my tongue, the absolute currency of the road ahead, where every milestone was paid for with a piece of the man I used to be. The silence of the lower gorge was different from the silence of the archive. In the archive, the quiet had been an active construction, built out of stone walls, heavy oak doors, and the disciplined, muted breathing of senior scholars who understood the value of an undisturbed column of numbers. It was a protective barrier, a shield designed to keep the chaotic, unpredictable noise of the lower districts from leaking into the pristine clarity of our records. Out here, the silence was a vacuum. It was the heavy, suffocating pause that occurs between the lightning strike and the thunderclap, a space where reality itself felt as though it had been hollowed out by a giant chisel. I followed Kaelen's shadow at a distance of 30 paces, my left boot dragging heavily through the loose shale with a dry, rhythmic scrape. Clinch, clinch! The sound of his chainmail was gone now, his armor stripped of its structural integrity where my aura had brushed against his gauntlets. He walked with a jerky, uncoordinated gait, his long arms hanging loose at his sides, his head turned slightly toward the eastern cliff face, as if he expected the limestone itself to split open and demand an accounting of the blood we had spilled. "You're doing it again," Elara's voice whispered from the brush to my left. She had dropped back from her scouting position, her slender frame partially concealed by the shadow of a gnarled silicate branch. I didn't turn my head to look at her. The vertigo was still sharp enough that any sudden movement caused the jagged horizon to tilt 45 degrees to the left. "Doing what?" "You're matching his stride," she said, her amber eyes wide as she tracked the movement of my legs. Every time Kaelen takes a step with his left foot, your left foot moves at the exact same millisecond. Your intervals? They aren't human, Torin. You look like a pair of grandfather clocks ticking in the same empty room. I forced my fingers to relax, breaking the unnatural, rhythmic cadence that the patron had left behind in my muscles. The body retains the metric of the conversion, Elara. It is a mathematical necessity. When the entity uses the nervous system to process a calculation, the neural pathways remain aligned to that frequency for several hours following the event. A calculation, she repeated, her voice dripping with a cold, calculating sarcasm that failed to hide the genuine horror beneath her words. That's what you're calling it now. Joran was an entry in a ledger. The riders were just lines to be rubbed out. What am I, Torin? Am I a decimal point? Is Kaelen a fraction you haven't figured out how to divide yet? I halted, my breath rattling uncomfortably against my dry teeth. The honesty in her suspicion was a physical weight, a persistent reminder of the analytical, arrogant monster I was systematically becoming. I looked at her, truly looked at her, through the grey, flickering static that still ruined the margins of my vision. I saw the tight line of her jaw, the way her hand trembled near her silver hilt, the way her breath came in short, panicked gasps that matched the rapid beating of my own heart. "You are my companions," I whispered, my voice sounding cracked and old. "You are the anchors that keep me from drifting into the gears of the void. If I didn't care about your lives, I would have let that purple fire take the entire basin. I fought with every ounce of my remaining humanity to turn that hand to the left. And look what your left hand did instead," Elara said quietly, pointing her dagger toward the northern horizon. Through the narrow opening of the limestone walls, the sky was still smoking. The white lattice of the fractured clouds was glowing with a faint, iridescent violet hue that didn't match the natural architecture of the dawn. The massive, cubic blocks of stone that had sealed the pass were visible in the distance, their smooth 90-degree surfaces looking like a row of giant teeth driven into the throat of the canyon. "The world doesn't bend that way, Torin," she said, her voice dropping all its defensive edge, leaving her sounding small, terrified, and painfully human. "Rocks don't split into perfect 10-foot cubes because a clerk waves his hand. Armor doesn't turn into oil because a priest gets angry. We aren't walking through the wastes anymore. We're walking through a nightmare you're active writing as we go." She turned away from me, her dark, hooded cloak swirling through the grey dust as she hurried to regain her position 20 paces ahead of Kaelen. We pressed on through the deepening twilight of the gorge until the canyon walls rose so high they completely blocked out the sky, trapping us in a dark, humid corridor that smelled intensely of stagnant iron water and old sulfur. The path beneath our boots grew slick with a thin, oily film of mineral mud, the residue of a landscape that had long ago been unmade by a previous alignment of the design. Kaelen stopped suddenly, near the mouth of a narrow, dark cavern that branched off from the main ravine. He didn't turn around to face me. He stood with his broad frame, filling the opening like a sentinel, his calloused hands resting heavily on his belt loops. "We hide here," he announced, his voice completely flat, carrying that professional, military weight that had entirely replaced his old warmth. "The watchtower on the ridge is less than 2 miles ahead. If they have a secondary signaling lantern lit, they'll spot our dust the moment we break cover into the lower wash. We stay in the shadows until the moon passes the crest." I slid down the smooth limestone wall of the cavern, my joints popping loudly in the quiet enclosure. The stone was cold, slick, and entirely devoid of the rough, organic texture of the shale hills outside. For a brief, fragile second, the dark enclosure felt familiar. It resembled the lower vaults of the archive, where the forbidden, hidebound legaries were kept, places where the air was old, stale, and completely undisturbed by the wind. I leaned my head back against the stone, closing my eyes, desperate for a single moment of genuine human silence. But the silence was an illusion. The moment my eyelids closed, the low, rhythmic hum of the patron began to vibrate behind my cheekbones. It wasn't a sudden, violent intrusion this time. It was a steady, persistent frequency, like the purr of a massive animal sleeping directly beside me in the dark. The scent of ozone flared lightly in my nostrils, accompanied by that heavy, cloying sweetness of decaying lilies that had settled permanently into my throat. "The night is a defective cog," the entity murmured inside my consciousness, its tone entirely indistinguishable from my own deepest analytical thoughts. He watches the darkness, but he does not see the sequence. He thinks the old framework can protect him from the structural collapse. He does not understand that the collapse is the law. Be quiet, I thought back, using every ounce of my administrative, intellectual will to force the presence down into the deeper layers of my subconscious. He is right to fear me. I turned a man into ash. I broke his sword. I am a disease wearing his friend's skin. "A point on a line," the voice countered, its frequency rising until it vibrated behind my teeth with a cold, mathematical certainty. A single variable named Joran in a design that is already balancing toward zero. You think of individual breaths, Torin. You think like a mortal who sees only the click of the second hand. Look at the clock. Look at the entire mechanism. I opened my eyes, gasping slightly as the air in the cave suddenly grew dense, saturated with that cloying scent of white lilies. Kaelen was standing at the cavern mouth, his back perfectly straight, his posture rigid as a plumb line against the moonlight. He looked so intensely, beautifully human, a man willing to follow a disease into the belly of the beast simply because he had taken an oath to a version of me that no longer existed. "Kaelen," I said, my voice sounding cracked and dry in the quiet cave. He didn't move. He didn't turn his head. "Save your breath, Torin. You need to rest." "I need you to understand," I said, pushing myself up slightly, my left fingers gripping the cold oil-slick stone. "The transition. It isn't something I can control with logic. When the presence expands, my own thoughts are. They are shoved into a dark corner. I am a passenger, trapped behind my own eyes." Kaelen was silent for a long moment, the only sound the soft, distant whistle of the wind through the cubic stone blocks behind us. When he finally spoke, his voice was cracked with an ancient, heavy exhaustion that made him sound older than the high cleric I used to be. "When you were master of the ledgers, Torin, you told me that a man's vows are his skin." His words were slow, deliberate, and flat. "You said that if a man lets his vows tear, he has no structure left to hold his soul. Now you tell me you are a passenger. You tell me an apex predator is wearing your skin, and you expect me to just follow you into the dark gorge." "I don't expect you to follow me," I said, the intellectual clarity of my old life returning for a brief, agonizing second. "I am telling you that the structure we built in Dawnspire was already dead. The entity. It is showing me the rust, Kaelen. It is showing me that the law is just a cage we built because we were terrified of the sky." Kaelen finally turned around. His face was entirely in shadow, but I could see the glint of his eyes, cold, hard, and hollowed out by an absolute, terminal horror. "The cage kept people safe, Torin. The law kept that child in the caravan from being turned to ash. If your new world requires us to dissolve the petrified roots and liquefy the earth, then your new world is a slaughterhouse." He turned his back on me again, his posture rigid, ending the conversation with the absolute finality of an iron door dropping into place. I sank back against the stone wall, my fingers trembling in my lap. I looked down at my violet-tipped fingernails, which still held that faint, static pulse under the skin. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to tell him that I was terrified, that I missed the neat margins of my journals and the quiet security of my desk. But as I closed my eyes, the entity shifted in my mind, a sudden cold surge of dopamine washing through my nervous system, easing the ache in my split soul and replacing my human guilt with a cold, terrifying serenity. "Let him watch the basin," the patron whispered, its tone now entirely indistinguishable from my own deepest thoughts. "Let him guard the dead world. The road to the abyssal gate is already open, and he is already walking it. He just hasn't realized that the gears have stopped ticking." I fell into a fitful, dreamless sleep, the taste of copper thick on my tongue, while outside the cave, the moon rose over the limestone cliffs, casting long, geometric shadows that looked exactly like the bars of a tithing ledger.